Hello, class. I hope everyone is enjoying their isolation. Today, I'll be presenting the country of Mali, and hopefully, you'll be able to learn a thing or two. So, one of the main things I try and do is cross reference with the United States, because if I'm throwing out numbers, doesn't really make sense unless you get a reference of how we are in the United States. So, to start, I'll start with some of the recent history. In 1905, it was originally a French Sudan colonial, part of the French Sudan colonial territories. And during World War II, the French began to lose a lot of their territories, independence all across the world, as they were focusing on stopping the Nazi invasion. And that led over into the 60s, where Mali eventually gained their independence from France. And on September 22nd, which is their Independence Day, they formed the Republic of Mali. But it ended up taking about another 32 years until 1992, when they had their first democratic election that involved multiple parties. And in an event prior to that, 1991, there was a anti-government protest called the March Revolution, and there were dozens of students killed that were protesting against the government, and the military eventually turned on the government for its tyrannical regime. Uh, some of the more recent in the past decade, there's been increased terrorism. In 2012, this stopped around 2015, but in northern Mali, there was independence rebellions that were first aided by Islamic groups, but eventually those were taken over as those Islamic groups began pushing Sharia law, and that's what they sought out for the entire country of Mali. And in 2015, in central Mali, where fights continue to today, there was land disputes over water and land and agricultural supplies of the small communities, and the UN has actually intervened as there have been multiple jihadist attacks that have targeted schools and communities. The formal government, however, is the Republic of Mali, and it is a republic type very similar to the United States with three branches, except their president is in office for 5 years and also is only allowed two terms. And once again, similarly, the age of suffrage is 18. And their constitution, which was originally adopted in 1992, is very similar to the French-based laws, as that is what most common laws that they had due to the prior control by the French. The economy, now I'll start cross-referencing it with the United States. The GDP was 41.22 billion in 2017, and compare that to the US, which was just shy of 20 trillion, which is two huge different markets that we're talking about here. Mali is no industrialized country, to say the least. The currency that they use is the West African CFA franc, which about $1 is about roughly 606 of the francs. Exports was about 3 billion and imports were about 3.6 billion. So they are in a trade deficit as their imports uh, are greater than their exports. And one of their biggest exporting partners is Switzerland with about 32% of all exports, and Senegal, the biggest import, which is about 25%. And Senegal is a neighboring country, so that makes sense. For the sectors, they are still in a large agricultural sector with 80% of the labor force in that field. However, they've seen an increase in services over the past decade, 20 years, but still agriculture is one of the main labor forces. Industries, gold and phosphate mining are still two of the greater industries that they have, as well as food processing for the cattle, which is one of their larger agricultural products, along with cotton, rice, and corn. The demographic and culture, it's very diverse, which is one thing that I found out. However, one of the larger ethnic groups is the Bambara people, which takes about a third of the population. And one thing I thought that was really interesting is that French is the national language. However, most people speak the native Barbara uh, tongue or language, which I thought was pretty interesting, even though French is declared the national language. Religions, a majority of the country is Muslim with about 94%. And there has been a recent increase in urbanization. However, most still live in rural communities in the south. The hedge fund actually had a study where they reported that a score of 58.1 was their freedom score, and that makes and with these large demographic groups and various cultures, it makes it tough as there's so many independence groups that don't really participate in the formal government or have much of a care as they're locked away in their rural communities, don't really have any intention going into the cities. The happiness score was a 4.39 out of, well, that was their ranking, and a score that ranks them 128th out of 156 nations. And two of the lower scores that they had was their generosity, which was 138th ranked, and that also ties back to being so diverse, so spread out. No one's really interacting with each other. Everyone's kind of got their own territories, their own cultures, which could lead to a lot of fights, which we saw in Mali in 2015. Again, the health life expectancy is very low. It's 142 ranked, and the life expectancy is only around 62 years. Again, third world country, not really developed, not that much industry going on, very agricultural. However, another thing I found that was interesting was that most of the mothers' average first birth was around 19 years old, with roughly 6 children per woman. And with numbers like that, the population is expected to double by 2035. Education, the literacy rate for males was about double of what the females were, males being 46%, females being 27. And that mostly goes to them still having the male dominated space of them being out and about while women are still kept at home, laboring to the children while the men go out and work. However, both the average school years was 7 years, males getting 8, women getting 7. So it seems like men are the ones who usually will pursue the higher education rate after their average years of school. Youth unemployment is around 17%, and when compared to the US prior to what's going on now is 8%. However, it's now up to 10%. And about 3.1% of the GDP was spent on education, while compare that to the US, roughly 5%. However, Mali has been increasing their GDP spent on their military to combat the independence groups and terrorist groups in the north and central regions. And another thing that was interesting was they have 2 years of mandatory service for 18-year-old males, and women are highly pushed to volunteer in the lines of service. Their relation with the US, like most African nations currently, there's a lot of just foreign aid being dumped into these countries. However, the US and Mali government do share the common interest of increasing a secure democracy and economic growth. And poverty has actually begun to decrease since about 2012. The U.S. foreign aid in the combined years of 2016 and 2017 totaled about 275 million, and the U.S. is really hoping to stabilize the country to increase their democracy in order to combat those terrorist groups that are mobilizing there. Mali is also part of the UN, WTO, and IMF, which the U.S. is a part of. But I mean, in terms of markets, opportunities, Mali does not really have that much besides their natural resources. However, with the US attempt to help modernize the country could open for commercial markets in the cities as well as manufacturing, but due to the unstable groups and government, cheaper labor is more reliable in South Asian nations, which is one of the big things the US is about. Got to find that cheap labor. Impacted by coronavirus. Now, their testing is not as high because they lack that central government and because people aren't so eager to go get themselves tested. But they have, as I was researching this, 389 confirmed cases, and of that, 112 have recovered and 23 have died. But not really much has changed. The U.S. has continued their aid and helped to guide the government to make sure safety measures are taken. They established curfews on markets, and one impact that is having is on the election cycle for the assembly, which is taking place right now. And there was already threats of jihadist attacks postponing the elections, but now with the threat of coronavirus, even less people are eager to go out and take to the polls. And that is all I have. I hope you guys enjoyed and stay safe.